Hello everyone, it's me Uncle John. Today I am going to read S66066 Nelson Mandela by Rowena Akienemy. Chapter 1, The Beginning. On 18th July 1918, a baby boy was born to the Mandela family in a small village just south of Kunu in the Transkei province of South Africa. The child was given the name Roli Lahala, which means troublemaker in the Xhosa language. The Transkei is one of the most beautiful parts of South Africa, with hills and many rivers, beautiful flowers in the spring, and green trees all year round. Roli Dahala Roli Lala was one of 13 children of a chief of the Tembu people. During his childhood, he played games in the fields around Kunu with other children of the village, looked after the sheep and cows, and swam in the cold river which came down from the hills. At the age of 7, Roli Lala went to school, the only one of his brothers and sisters to do so. And it was on his first day at school that his teacher, Miss Dingena, gave him the English name of Nelson, the name which later became world famous. When he was 9, Nelson's father died, and his mother took him to live with his uncle, Chief Jongin Taba, the king of the Temple people. Early one morning, Nelson and his mother left Kunu. It was a day's walk along rough roads to Nelson's new home. They did not talk as they walked, but much later, Mandela wrote, "The silence of the heart between mother and child is not a lonely one. My mother and I never talked very much, but we did not need to. At last, when it was nearly dark, they reached the village of the Hekeziwini. Chief Jong Taba lived in a large home with gardens of apple trees, vegetables, and flowers. This was the great place of the Tembu, where Nelson lived, with his uncle, aunt, and cousins. Nelson saw how a leader should behave. He watched and listened while his uncle met his people in order to discuss the problems in their lives, the dry weather, or new laws made by the white government. From his uncle, Nelson learned about the history of the African people and the arrival of white people. The Tembu people are part of the Xhosa nation. Xhosa are farming people who moved down from Central Africa and have lived in the southeastern areas of Tiski and Transkei since the 11th century. The first white people arrived from Europe on the most southern coast of Africa in 1652. For the next 200 years, the African nations who lived there, the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sotos, and others, fought against the white people who took their land, but in the end, the old weapons of the African soldiers could not win against the modern guns of the soldiers from Europe. Two groups of white people lived in South Africa, those Britain from who spoke English, and those from the Netherlands who became known as Afrikaners and spoke Afrikaan, a kind of Dutch. Although the British and the Afrikaners hated each other, these two groups learned to work together against the African people. In 1910, the Afrikaner, the Transvaal and Orange Free State, joined the British Cape Province and Natal to become the 4 provinces of the Union of South Africa. A nation with a white government, although about 70% of the people who lived there were black. The discovery of diamonds in the British city of Kimberley in 1867 and the discovery of gold in the Afrikaner province of Transvaal in 1886 had changed the history of South Africa. Africans were forced to dig in the diamond and gold mines, but the money from the gold and diamonds went to the white owners of the mines. African miners lived in poor condition. About 50 men had to live in one room. Each black worker had to carry a pass, paper signed by a white official, which showed that the worker was allowed to be near the mine. In the 20s, the new laws prevented Africans from getting jobs with good pay and from owning land and houses in the town. In the 1930s, white workers earned 5 times more than African workers. In 1936, while Nelson was at school, the white parliament in Cape Town removed the right to vote from the few Africans who had it. A new law forced all African men to carry a pass in order to travel, to get a job, or to be out late at night. If an African was caught without a pass, he was put in prison. The government also decided 87% of the land in South Africa must be kept for the 2 million white people. Most of this land was the best land in the country. The other 13% of the land, most of it poor land, was left for the 8 million Africans. In 1939, Chief Jongintaba sent Nelson to the University College of Fort Hare, the best college in South Africa for black students, about 100 kilometers away, near the small town of Alice. There were 150 African students at the college, and Nelson made friends with boys from other parts of South Africa, including a student called Oliver Tambo. Tambo was a year older than Nelson, and they remained friends for life. At Fort Hare, Nelson enjoyed sport, playing football and running, and he also spent hours in the evening listening to music and dancing with other students. At this time, his dream was to build his mother a new home in Kunu after he finished his study. But his days at Fort Hare ended sooner than he had planned. At the end of his second year, Nelson was elected to the Students' Committee, and he joined other students to protest about the food at the college and to ask the teachers to listen to the opinions of the committee. The college told Nelson that unless he changed his mind about the press, he could not return to the college for his final year. During the holidays, Chief Jongintaba told Nelson that he must obey the college. The chief also told Nelson that he had arranged marriages for Nelson and for his own son, Justice. It was the custom in those days for parents to arrange marriage for their children, but neither Justice nor Salon wanted to marry the girls chosen for them. They were not strong enough to tell the chief that they disagreed with him, so they decided to leave KwaZulu secretly and go north to Johannesburg, one of the biggest cities in South Africa, about 600 kilometers away. Chapter 2, Johannesburg. In order to pay for their journey, the boys secretly sold 2 of the chief's cows. African men had to carry a pass. They traveled, but although Nelson and Justice did not have the necessary papers, they traveled north first by train and then finally by car to Johannesburg. At about 10 o'clock one evening, they saw the lights of the city. I had reached the end of what seemed like a long journey, Mandela wrote many years later. But it was actually the very beginning of a much longer and more trying journey. Nelson began work as a guard at one of Johannesburg's gold mines. But the news of his escape from home followed him, and he lost a job. A cousin then introduced him to Walter Sisulu, a businessman several years older than Nelson. Walter Sisulu had worked in many jobs, deep under the ground in a gold mine, in the kitchen of a white family, and in a factory, and used his time in the evenings to study. It was Walter who found Nelson a job in the office of a white lawyer called Lazar Sidelsky, who was interested in African schools and who taught Nelson a lot about the law. Johannesburg was the richest city in South Africa, with the largest gold mines in the world. The people of South Africa called it the City of Gold. In 1939, more than 300,000 Africans worked in the gold mines of Johannesburg. There were 43,000 white workers who earned over 11 times more than the black workers. Between 1933 and 1966, 19,000 gold miners died in accidents there. 93% of them were African. In Johannesburg, Nelson saw more cars and more tall buildings than he had ever seen before, but he also saw for the first time the injustice of life in South Africa. He lived in the African township of Alexandra, far from the large, beautiful houses where rich white people lived and enjoyed the wealth from the mines. Townships were the areas outside the city where black people had to live. There was no running water or electricity, and houses were poor and crowded. Nelson was so poor that he often walked the 10 kilometers to work and then the 10 kilometers back again. And for 5 years, he wore the same suit to work. Another African worked in Setlsky's office. The Gor Radeve was interested in political ideas, and at lunch times, he talked to Nelson about the history of Africa and the living conditions of black Africans in South Africa. Nelson and the girl joined the 10,000 people marching through the streets of Alexandria. They were protesting about a rise in the price of traveling on the buses. In 1941, Chief Jongin Taba visited Johannesburg. Nelson was worried about seeing his uncle for the first time, since he ran away from Kjeski, the Kezuweni, but the chief was kind to Nelson and talked only about his future, not his past. A few months later, Chief Jongin Taba died, and Nelson and Justice traveled back home to Kezuweni. Justice stayed at the Great Palace, became the new king of the Temple people, but Nelson returned to Johannesburg. Although Nelson's heart was with his family and people, he knew that he wanted a different life for himself. Nelson began to study law in the evenings at the University of Witwatersrand, where for the first time he studied with white students. It was here that he became friends with Joe Slobo, Ruth First, and Bram Fisher, whose father was president of one of the Afrikaner provinces of South Africa. Most of the white students, however, did not want to talk to or sit next to a black student. Nelson often visited the house of Walter and Albertina Sisulu for meals and long conversation about the rights and living conditions of black Africans in South Africa. It was there that Nelson met and fell in love with a pretty girl, Evelyn Mays, who was training to be a nurse and who worked with Albertina. They soon married and moved into their own home, number 8115 Orlando West, another African township, which later became part of Soweto. In 1946, their son, Dembekile, was born, followed in 1947 by their first daughter. She was often ill, and for many nights, Nelson and Evelyn stayed awake, taking care of her. When she was 9 months old, their daughter died, which was a great sadness to them. Nelson and Oliver Tambo, who was now living in Johannesburg, began to go to the meetings of the African National Congress with Walter Sisulu. African National Congress, ANC, was started in 1912 by 4 young African lawyers. They wanted to change South Africa so that Africans could be elected to parliament and could own land. They believed that Africans should work together to get better conditions for black people in South Africa. Nelson soon became very involved in the work of the organization. In 1947, when he was elected to the ANC committee of the Transvaal province, he felt ready to give his heart fully to the work of the ANC. The elections of 1948, in which only white people could vote, were won by the Afrikaner National Party, led by Dr. Daniel Malan. The National Party did not want black people to enjoy the wealth of the country or have a part in the political life of South Africa. Dr. Malan introduced a political system called the apartheid, a new word, but an old idea. There were laws to separate white and black people in all areas of life: schools, work, hospitals, housing areas. Even marriage from 1948, whites-only signs appeared in many places. Taxis, ambulances, buses, restaurants, hotels, parks, and even beaches in sports too White and black people could not play together. Mandela finished his studies in 1952 and became a lawyer. With Oliver Tambo, he opened the first African law office in Johannesburg, in a small building near the center of the city. Crowds came to the new office because they knew that the African lawyers would give them good advice. Mandela and Tambo heard about land that was taken from Africans and given to white people. They heard about people who were kicked and beaten by the police. They were busy all day long, and then in the evening they went to political meetings. On 26 June 1952, after many months of careful planning, the defiance campaign began. The ANC, the Communist Party, and the Indian Congress all worked together on this campaign. Africans worked with Indians brought to South Africa in the 1860s by the British government as cheap workers, and with colored people whose parents had a different skin color from each other. The idea behind the campaign was to show defiance, to refuse to obey the laws that were not fair. All over South Africa, non-white people used whites-only entrances to railway stations and offices and entered the townships without pass. During the campaign, Mandela drove all over the country in order to explain the campaign to the Africans living in the townships. He worked so hard that his little son Tembelakele to ask his mother, "Where does daddy live?" The campaign continued for 6 months, and during that time, police arrested more than 8,000 people. Mandela and Walter Sisulu were arrested with other members of the ANC. Among the Indians arrested was Ahmed Kathrada, a young man aged 21, who soon became another good friend of Mandela's. They were kept in prison for 2 days and then released. The campaign was a new experience for Mandela. He became more confident because the campaign showed white people that Africans were not afraid to fight against the system of apartheid and that they had not lost their dignity. Chapter 3, Working for the ANC, 1953 to 1960. Sophiatown was an African township only 6 kilometers west of the center of Johannesburg. It was one of the few places where Africans had been able to buy houses, and many had lived there for more than 50 years. Because the Sophiatown was close to the center of the city, several families lived in each home, with as many as 40 people getting their water from a single tap. Sophiatown was just surrounded by towns where white workers lived, and the government waited to move white workers into Sophiatown. In 1953, the government started to force Africans out of their homes in Sophiatown to New Township, about 20 kilometers from the city. This was part of the government's plan to control where Africans could live and work. The ANC organized meetings in Sophiatown for many months as they tried to prevent the government's plan to destroy the township. Mandela spoke at these meetings until September 1953, when he was banned for 2 years under a law introduced in 1950. This law allowed the government to stop any person from going to meetings, leaving town, belonging to political organizations, or meeting friends. Although Mandela was not accused of any crime for 2 years, he was forbidden to go to any meetings or to leave Johannesburg. And he was even unable to go to his son's birthday party. He was also forced to leave the ANC. Mandela was unable to go to the national meeting of the ANC in September 1953, and another member of the ANC and read his words for him. Mandela said that Africans must be prepared for a different type of struggle. He believed that truth would win and that injustice would be defeated, but he told them there is no easy walk to freedom. Many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death again and again before we reach the mountain tops of our desires. These words became famous. Mandela had read about the difficulties and bravery of the Indian leader, Pandit Nehru, and he took the words, "No easy walk to freedom" from Nehru. At the beginning of 1955, 4,000 police and soldiers arrived at Sophiatown and began to move people out and to destroy their home. The ANC had failed to save Sophiatown. Mandela began to realize that the government would not listen to the ANC's non-violent protest. In 1953, the government had passed a law which separated the African school system from the white school system in order to force African children to go to public school. Dr. Hendrik de Verwoerd, who was Minister of African Schools at the time, said that the only place for Africans in South Africa was in some types of work. He meant that Africans would only do boring, badly paid work, so they did not need to go to expensive school. ANC organized a protest about this law. Mandela wanted Africans to set up their own schools. In the 50s, the government spent £44 every year for each white student, £19 for each colored and Asian student, and less than £8 for each African student. After 1959, all universities were forbidden to accept black students without the agreement of the government. By 1978, 80% of university students were white. In June 1955, a Congress of the People was organized by the ANC and many other groups which were working for freedom. The Congress was organized to discuss the Freedom Charter, which was a list of ideas from all the groups. It was held in Kliptown, a village a few kilometers outside Johannesburg. Mandela and Walter Sisulu had to drive there secretly because they were both banned. For 2 days, about 3,000 people discussed the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter became important in the struggle for freedom because it described the wishes of Africans for a free South Africa. It said that every man and woman should be able to vote for the government, that all national groups should have equal rights, and that the land and wealth of the nation should be shared by all people. Most of the people at the Congress were black, but there were also Indian and colored people, and more than 100 white people. On the afternoon of the second day, police with guns surrounded the meeting and wrote down the name of each person there. But Mandela had seen the police arrive and quickly returned to Johannesburg. In 1955, Mandela's ban ended and he was free to travel. He had been looking forward to leaving the city and returning to the hills of his childhood. He visited Kunu and Kekezweni for the first time for 13 years. He was happy to see his mother, sister, and older friends, to walk in the fields where he had played as a child, and to look up at the stars at night. He asked his mother to come and live with him in Johannesburg, but she did not want to leave the countryside. Mandela then traveled to Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and other parts of South Africa in order to meet members of the ANC before driving back to Johannesburg along the beautiful beaches of the Indian Ocean. Early one morning in December 1956, Mandela was woken by loud knocks on the door of his home in Orlando West. It was the police who searched the house for more than an hour before arresting Mandela and taking him to Johannesburg's old prison, the Fort. There, Mandela discovered that the police had arrested 156 people, members of the ANC and other freedom groups, who had been at Kliptown. They were forced to take off their clothes and stand for an hour in the cold air before being taken to large cells where they were kept for 2 weeks. At last, They were taken to court and charged with treason. The government said that the ideas of the Freedom Charter were communist. This proved, the government said, that the freedom groups were planning to destroy the government. 156 accused were allowed to leave prison, but they had to report to the police once a week and were forbidden to go to any meetings while they waited for the trial to begin. When Mandela returned home, he discovered that Evelyn had moved out with her children and gone to live with her brother. The marriage was over. Mandela's work with the ANC had given him little time with his family. Evelyn had become more and more involved with her church. And slowly they had begun to live separate lives. All of their children were hurt by this. Mandela continued to visit them often. He was still their father, although he was no longer Evelyn's husband. But Bram Fisher and the other lawyers prepared for the trial for many months. During this time, Mandela met a lovely young woman in Oliver Tambo's office, and he knew at once that he wanted to marry her. Winnie Madikizela had just finished training and was working at an African hospital in Johannesburg. They were married in 1958. In the difficult time that lay ahead, Winnie's love would help to make Mandela strong. The treason trial began in August 1958. In the end, 30 of the accused went to court every day. Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, and the others went by bus with their lawyers to the court in Pretoria. A 2-hour journey away. At lunchtime, they sat outside in a friend's garden, ate lunch, which was cooked by their Indian friends. In the evening, Mandela went back to Johannesburg to catch up with all his work at the law office and to go to ANC meeting. In 1958, while the treason trial continued, Dr. Hendrik de Verwoerd became prime minister. He wanted Africans to be separated from white people even more than before. So one of the first things he said as prime minister was that all Africans must be called the Bantus. In 1959, he created 8 Bantustans where black people had to live with their chiefs. Black people could no longer expect any rights in the parts of South Africa which white people controlled. Treason trial was stopped suddenly on 21st March 1960. And at the morning, there was a terrible disaster at Sharpeville, small township about 55 kilometers south of Johannesburg. The Pan-African Congress, PAC, New African Organization, had organized a protest against the past laws. As part of this process, crowd of several thousand marched to the police station in Sharpeville without their passes. The crowd waited quietly, but as the crowd got larger, the police became more worried. The police began to shoot at the crowd. People turned and tried to run away, but the police continued to shoot. When they stopped shooting, 69 people had been killed. Protests against the death came from all over the world, including the United Nations. Thousands of Africans, including Chief Ludilo Mandela and other members of ANC, burned their passes to protest against the apartheid government's terrible crime, and the police arrested 18,000 people. In this difficult time, the ANC decided that Oliver Tambo must leave South Africa in order to organize the ANC abroad. Mandela and Tambo law office was shut. Tambo escaped from South Africa. The police knocked again, and Mandela's door and his house was searched again. Mandela was taken to Pretoria prison with the other 30 accused. They were kept in small, dirty cells. And the treason trial continued. In August 1960, Mandela finally spoke at the trial, and he was questioned about many of his ideas. Mandela told the court that the ANC wanted all people of South Africa to be able to vote for their government. They were prepared to organize protests until the government said, "Let's talk." Then they would agree to talk. In March 1961, more than 4 years after the first arrest, the trial ended. "You're found not guilty," the judge said. you may go. Outside the court, the crowd danced and sang the national song of the ANC. Kosi Sikele Africa. The name of the song means God bless Africa, asking God to protect the African people, and it was composed in 1897 by Enoch Sontunga, a teacher in Johannesburg. It was written in Hausa and was sung as a protest song during the years of apartheid. Now it's famous all over the world as the national song of South Africa, and it is sung in many languages of the South African people, including Afrikaans. Mandela did not go home that night. After many meetings, ANC leaders had decided to continue working secretly. Mandela was asked to travel secretly around the country and organize protests. Mandela's eldest son, Thembekile, was away at school, but he went to say goodbye to his children who were living in Orlando East with their mother, Evelyn. Then he went home and said goodbye to his two youngest daughters, Jenny and Jinji. I will be going away for a long time, he told their mother when his new life underground had begun. Chapter 4, The Spare of the Nation, 1961 and 1962. Mandela continued his work for the ANC. He knew he could be sent to prison if the police found out about his work. Mandela moved secretly from place to place for some months. He wore glasses and a dirty blue uniform with the driver's hat as he drove to meetings in the townships and in the villages. He began organizing African workers to hold a stay-at-home, a protest in which workers refused to go to work, in order to force the government to organize a national meeting for all South Africans. Several times, the police nearly caught him. Once he stopped at some traffic lights and saw a chief policeman sitting in the car next to him. Another afternoon in Johannesburg, an African policeman walked towards him. As he passed, the policeman smiled at Mandela and secretly gave him the thumbs up ANC sign. For a few weeks, Mandela stayed with Wolfie Kodesh, a newspaperman, in his small flat in a white part of the city. He stayed inside the flat during the day and went out to meetings at night. Every morning, he woke up early and ran in the small sitting room for an hour to keep himself healthy. It's a custom of the Shosha people to drink thick milk, and Mandela kept a bottle of this milk outside the window of the flat. One day, as he sat in the sitting room, Mandela heard the two Africans talking as they walked past the flat. It was strange, they said, to see a bottle of Shosha milk outside the white man's flat. At the moment, Mandela knew he had to leave the Wolfie's flat. The police made many arrests at this time in order to prevent the stay at home. On 29th May 1961, thousands of Africans, joined by Indian and colored workers, stayed home from work in Durban, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Johannesburg. But the stay at home was not a success in all parts of the country, and the government did not listen to the call for the national meeting. In 1961, B.J. de Borta became Minister of Justice. He told the police they could forget about the rights of Africans. After the treason trial, the government realized that the courts and judges were not going to do everything the government wanted. And so the police were not given the freedom to beat and torture anyone they arrested. On Freedom Day in June 1961, Mandela sent a letter to all the newspapers. He again asked the government to call a national meeting to talk about the freedom Africans wanted. He promised that he would continue to fight against apartheid. I will not leave South Africa. The struggle is my life. I will continue fighting for freedom until the end of my days. But the government refused to listen. Mandela now believed that violence was necessary in order to change the government's idea. After discussing this with Walter Sisulu, Mandela went to a secret meeting of ANC leaders in Durban. Meeting continued all night for 50 years. ANC had been non-violent, but at the end of this meeting, Mandela was asked to organize a new group. This new group was separate from the ANC and was called the Umkhonto uWesizwe. The Spirit of the Nation, or MK, was going to use violence to fight against the government. The fighting weapon in the group's name, the spear, showed that a different kind of struggle was beginning. Mandela asked Joe Slovo to join this new group. Joe Slovo, an old friend, was a member of the Communist Party, which had already decided that violence was necessary in order to change South Africa. In October, Mandela moved to Liliesleaf Farms in Livonia, a few kilometers north of Johannesburg, and he arranged some first papers. He became David Monsamai and worked as cook and driver to the white members of MK. Winnie visited Mandela for weekends with the two daughters, Zenny and Zinji. Liliesleaf, the members of MK lived together and planned the work of the new group. They decided MK would destroy power stations and railways. In order to make things difficult for the government, members of MK were told that they must not kill or injure people. December 1961, Chief Rutley received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work as a leader of the ANC and for the ANC's long history of nonviolence. Chief Rutley was the first African to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. The government gave him special permission to go to Norway to receive the prize. A week later, on 16th December 1961, first MK bombs exploded at power station and government offices in Johannesburg, Port Elizabeth, and Durban. The time of non-violence was over. In January 1961, Mandela escaped from South Africa to go to a meeting of African leaders in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He drove secretly out of South Africa into the Bechuanaland, now Botswana, then flew to Dar es Salaam, where he met Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanganyika, and then he went on to Addis Ababa, where he met Emperor Haile Selassie, and for the first time he saw African soldiers commanded by an African leader. He also met Kenneth Kaunda, who later became the president of Zambia. At this meeting of African leaders, Mandela thanked the African countries that were helping the fight against apartheid. Oliver Tambo, who was living and working for the ANC in Dar es Salaam, traveled with Mandela to various African countries. They arranged training for MK members, and they met freedom fighters from other African countries. Mandela also met his old friend Gaul Radebe, who was now a member of the PAC in Dar es Salaam. On his way back to South Africa, Mandela met the first group of MK members who who were traveling to Ethiopia to train as soldiers. Mandela felt proud to meet these brave young men. Every year Mandela went in Africa, he found that it was his character that mattered, not the color of his skin. For the first time, he felt free from the injustice of apartheid. At last, Mandela flew back to Botswana and he drove all night back into South Africa with Cecil William, a white member of NK. Once again, he became David Munsa Mai. They returned to Ridley Sleeve, farm in Livonia. Then, after discussing his visit to the African country with the members of MK, Mandela and Cecil left to Ridley Sleeve for secret meetings with the ANC in Durban. When these meetings were finished, Mandela and Cecil began the 700-kilometer drive back to Johannesburg. He was wearing his driver's coat and they talked about their political plans. As they left waters of the Indian Ocean behind them and drove throughout the beautiful green hills of Natal, they had only driven about 100 kilometers when Mandela noticed a car filled with white men slowing down in front of the car he was driving. When he looked behind, he saw two more cars filled with white men. Mandela knew immediately that his life underground was over. If he tried to jump from the car, escape into the tree, the police would kill him at once. So he pushed his gun and paper down the sides of the car seat, where the police never found him. It was August 1962. After his arrest, Mandela was taken to the fort in Johannesburg and locked in a cell alone. Winnie was allowed to visit him in prison. They talked about which friends would help Winnie and how she would manage alone. Mandela asked her to tell the children the truth about his arrest. Crowds of people protested against Mandela's arrest, and when the trial began, outside the court, Winnie was in court wearing colorful Xhosa clothes. When Mandela entered the court, also wearing Xhosa clothes, the crowd stood up, and there were shouts of Amanda Nagwata. Mandela was accused of organizing a stay-at-home by African worker. He was also charged with leaving South Africa without travel paper. Mandela told the court of his troubling feelings about apartheid. I hate apartheid. I have fought it all my life. I fight it now and I will do so until the end of my days. He said he was not guilty of any crime, and when he came out of prison, he would take up the struggle against injustice again. The day before Mandela was sentenced, United Nations asked all countries to refuse to buy anything from South Africa. In November 1962, Mandela was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Mandela turned to the crowd in the court. Amandela, Amandela. He shouted 3 times. The people began to sing the beautiful ANC song. Kosi Sikele, Africa, and Mandela still heard them singing as the police drove him away. For 6 months, Mandela was kept in Pretoria prison. Now that he was a prisoner, not someone waiting for trial, he had to wear the prison uniform of African prisoner, which was his short trousers and a shirt. The food was cold porridge. Twice a day, for many hours every day, the prisoners sat outside on the ground and sewed bags for the post office. While he worked, Mandela was able to talk occasionally to other political prisoners. For example, Robert Sobukwe, the leader of the PAC. Sobuk was in prison for 3 years, but as soon as he was released, he was rearrested. Unlike Mandela, Sobukwe refused to protest about prison conditions. One night at the end of May, Mandela was told to pack his things. He was driven all night in a police truck without windows with 3 other political prisoners to Cape Town, about 1,500 kilometers away. The prisoner were then taken in an old wooden boat to the Robben Island. Robben Island is a small, flat island about 11 kilometers off the coast of Cape Town. In 1819, a famous Xhosa leader, Makana, was put in prison there by the British government. But he drowned as he tried to escape from the island. The island was used as a prison by the apartheid government and became known all over the world because of its famous prisoner. And Mandela and the other prisoners arrived on the island. The guards marched them from the boat to the prison. They were forced to take off their clothes, and the guards threw the clothes onto the floor, which was covered with water. Then the guards told them to put their cold, wet clothes back on. Mandela knew that life on Robben Island was going to be difficult, but he was only there for a few weeks before he was taken back to Pretoria. On 11th July, the police had surrounded Lily's Life farm and arrested Walter Sisulu and 8 other members of MK. Mandela was back in court, this time accused of sabotage. The end.